So thank you all for being here today. We're going to go ahead and get started. It's about 11:59, so we're almost starting at noon. And I just wanted to thank everyone for being here. I'm super excited to talk to Jay and to talk about his studio and practice. And I believe he's got some slides for us to look at as well. And I think it's going to be a great addition to our Behind the Lens segment that we've been doing at the MoCP. Before we get started, I just wanted to give Jay a little introduction. So I'm going to read off some of his words here. So Jay Wolke is an artist and educator living in Chicago, Illinois. His photographic monographs include All Around the House, photographs of American Jewish communal life from 1998, Along the Divide, photographs of the Dan Ryan Expressway from 2004, and among others. His works have been exhibited internationally and are in the permanent print collections of the Whitney Museum of American Art and the New York MoMA, the Art Institute of Chicago, and the San Francisco MoMA, among others. His photographs have appeared in numerous publications, including the New York Times, the Financial Times Magazine, Exposure, Newsweek, and Fortune, to name a few. From 1992 to 1999, he was a coordinator of the Graduate Documentary Photography program at the Institute of Design, and he is currently a professor of photography at Columbia College Chicago. Jay, I consider to be a friend and a mentor. He's a super sharp guy and just absolutely loves photography, so I'm excited for us all to be here to share a little bit of that with Jay. So Jay, I'm super happy you're here, and I'm going to let you turn over and talk a little bit about your space. We can see a little bit over your shoulder there, and then I believe you have some slides, and I'll just kind of moderate the questions as they come in.
Dylan, thank you so much. And yes, I consider you a friend and a colleague. You're a great photographer yourself, and I'm so honored that Kristen and you have invited me to do this. I apologize, my notifications don't seem to shut up, so either you're going to hear me or not, so you might hear a ding or two. Anyway, I am honored to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And so I was first told that I should show a little bit of my studio, and I'll try to do that. So I'm going to walk around a little bit with this silly laptop and see if we can get a better view, because this is supposed to be a studio visit. So I'm just going to walk around a little bit, and you'll see that it's a storefront. I live down in the Bridgeport area of Chicago, and I bought this place in 1990, and I have never regretted it. I always say to people, the first thing you have to do is make sure you've got a space that you can really work in and feel comfortable about, and something that you can work long hours. And whether it's part of your home or somewhere else, it's very important to have that in mind. This room here, as I say, this was a butcher shop actually for about 60 years. When I took it over, it was there were holes in the walls and meat hooks and a falling over meat locker. And I have since renovated a couple of times. This is one of the original renovations, though I haven't changed it much. And you can see that I've got these magnetic walls that I've put up. I put up years ago. And I don't want you to think that I just put up all these photographs for today. They've been going up over the last month, actually. And these are works which I'll show you in a few minutes. These are pieces that I have done over the last 12 or 13 years that I'm organizing, I hope, into my next book. And I'll talk a little more about it. But, you know, as you can understand, it's important to be able to look at things both virtually and physically. And so I find it very important to put up these little 11 by 14s. Also, you can see I have a long work table. I've got one of my scan pieces over there on it. I don't know if you can see it, it doesn't matter. But anyway, that's where we're at. Unless you've got some questions to start with, I guess I could go right into slides. I've tried to put a selection together today that, you know, firstly, I want to say that Dylan, you did a marvelous job on that color lecture last week. And that is one of my particular interests and has been over my entire career. And Anastasia Samoilova's lecture last night also dealt with a lot with color issues. So I guess I'm going to continue the theme a little bit today, because in fact, a lot of my work centers on that. But I have got a selection of works which I think particularly try to address some of those issues about color. Is it okay if I share my screen now? All good?
Yeah, of course.
All right, we're going to share the screen. And I will put this into. So I guess thank you for putting this image on the announcement, and I didn't know we were going to start with it. Sorry. What you're looking at is the cover of my the last book I published, which is called Same Dream Another Time, which are actually photographs I did many years ago. These are photographs I did between 1987 and 1992. And at that time, I was shooting or making photographs in Las Vegas, Reno, and Atlantic City for the most part. It was an outgrowth of an earlier project I was doing called Social Buffers in the Temporary Use of Public Space, which really had to do with how people exhibit private emotion in public spaces. And at that time, I decided, why not go to places that are devoted to this kind of temporary usage? And so that sort of began that sojourn to these gambling cities. And I didn't see them necessarily as places just to gamble. I saw them as places where people went for transformation, the ability to exercise activities, obviously, that they don't do in their home life. And they became fascinating artifacts and examples of American consumerism and the ambitions of American people. So this book came out in 2017. Jim McManus, the great writer, did the intro. It was a really honor to have him write the intro for it. So I'm going to show you a few images from that particular body of work. The reason I'm showing you these particular images is because they really deal with how, at that time, I was very interested in how the human figure is integrated into the environment. Not really portraiture per se, but how the human element resonates and completes or creates a story with the environment, and how the environment also creates the story with the individual. And I should say that in many ways, my particular approach always has dealt with form and light and color and space. Now, those are obviously formal issues, but I see them very much as the rhetoric of photography. This is our grammar. Space, we don't have a temporal ability with photography. We can make a photograph and refer to it as something that existed in time, but if I want the viewer to really enter into these places, I can only employ those strategies that construct a formal space that invites a viewpoint, a sort of democratic viewpoint, something that activates the entire space, something Kandinsky called a symphonic composition rather than a melodic one, where interwoven melodic themes create a larger set of conditions. I also believe, and especially in my documentary work, it is my function as a photographer to find that language which brings together all of the political and cultural and consumerist and material issues and social issues that then can be organized by those formal principles. So it's in a way a strategy, a game. It's the way I excite myself through my photography, and I'll show you some images. So you can see color has always been a part of my work. I promised Dylan I would talk at least about one image in terms of color. I think this is a good one. This is actually in front of Caesar's Palace in 1988, before one of the most famous fights ever happened, and that was between marvelous Marvin Hagler and Sugar Ray Leonard, and these are people out in front of the marquee. I went to Las Vegas particularly to photograph this event. I use medium format 6x7, a Plowbell camera at that time, which I had been waiting for years to come out. It was the perfect compromise between a small and a large format camera. And as I say, I was able to somehow integrate the gesture and humanity with the environment with enough detail and saturation of color to really explore what was going on visually. So here we see these people out in front of Caesar's palace. Obviously, the eye always goes to human figures and texts first. You can find that in Arnheim's Art and Visual Perception. And in this case, you can see there's a bit of a fakery going on. On the one hand, you see this bright yellow figure almost in the middle of the frame, which would, under any circumstances, demand the most important viewing. But the outsized scale of the Hagler banner, of course, forces your eye up into the marquee area more. And so then you've become forced to deal with other forms and spaces in the frame. So I'm going to show you a set of photographs from this that does deal with the integration of figure into the environment. By the way, this is a true dog and pony show. I just want you to know that is a real thing. And in Vegas and some of the side shows, you can find some stuff that you really didn't know was, well, of course, this was many years ago, but I always thought of a dog and pony show as something that we performed for other people just as a kind of cliche. But in fact, this young man had a dog and pony entertainment show. And I found that fascinating how those elements all came together. This was actually a tableau that I found in the swimming pool area during that Hagler-Leonard fight. So these are all sportscasters synchronizing their watches before the main broadcast of this event. And of course, for me, the idea of playing these figures off of these faux Roman statuaries and other people standing around created this wonderful space that I really am still attracted to this day. By the way, at the time I was using a small strobe with a reflector, and it really creates a kind of theatrical drama. So that strobe flattens out that foreground figure and really creates almost a diorama effect. So even heightening more of the space by using that artificial lighting even outside. I did all sorts of events. I went to Valentine's Day in Vegas. I went to Atlantic City with press credentials to do the Miss America pageant in 1989. And that's what you're seeing here is an autograph that's being given to a young girl. I went for funerals. I went for car shows. I went there for many different events besides gambling. But of course, gambling is the major pursuit in these places. So here are some dealers on break. And then finally, here is a 94-year-old lawyer I met in Reno, Nevada. So as you see, and then it was really a confluence of how these various elements could come together, both spatially, color, and narratively. I'm going to jump to another project now. This is a large format 4x5 project that I started in 2000. And this work here lasted between 2000 and 2007. I had been the head of art and graduate studies at a school in Florence in 1999 and 2000. And it was a guest position. And at that time, I was looking at the landscape of Italy and seeing some very, very particular conditions, especially in the South. And anyone in Italy will tell you, of course, the South and the North are quite different. And in fact, even now, I read in the newspapers, and it's fascinating to see how the North and the South of Italy have completely separated. And in fact, it used to be that nobody from the North wanted the people from the South to come up. Now it's the people from the South that don't want anybody from the North to come down. And it's really terrible what that pandemic has done to Italy. But this work here is called Architecture of Resignation. And what it explores is architectural landscape as it reflects the history of exploitation through architecture in the south of Italy, in the Mezzogiorno, which officially is Naples south through Sicily, but it has come to be understood as anything south of Rome. So I spent 7 years going back and forth, I think about 13, 14 trips. I would spend weeks or months at a time, just, exploring the landscape. And I'm looking for certain conditions, and it's even hard today to tell you what those conditions are, but it's one of those things where I knew it when I saw it. So here are a few images from that project. This is, by the way, this is a hill that's been carved away as a quarry, basically sort of like taking a big tree and cutting it down into a toothpick. So this is what's left after hundreds of years of quarrying a mountain. And it remains an artifact in the landscape. Piece of public art on the coast of Sicily. This is in the middle of Palermo, which still has damage from World War II. And from what I understand, it's going to be very difficult after the virus as well. Float pool south of Naples. This is the interior of an ancient Roman mausoleum, which is now being used as a, shall we say, a sex motel. And that's why the mattress is down. In many ways, this is a futuristic ruin. When Gibellina, a town in the middle of Sicily, was destroyed by earthquake in the 60s, the government moved everybody out of the town into a new area and rebuilt it using some of the most famous architects and artists in the country as in commission. But unfortunately, not all of the money got to where it needed to be. So there were some buildings like this cathedral, which remained half built for many, many years. This was the frontispiece of the book. In fact, what you're looking at here is a column which is in Brindisi on the coast, on the Adriatic coast of Italy in the south. And this was the official column right before you get to the water, to the Mediterranean. And this was the end of the Roman Empire at its time, during its time. And now it's just become an abused artifact that they have to keep putting more and more fences around to protect. This is a metro station in Naples. I love the capriciousness and the fantasy that goes on with some of the building. And of course, my feeling about photography is that, when we frame something and make a photograph of it and essentially write or create a language for this, we're separating it from all of the mythologies and subjectivities that surround these places in real time and in real life, and the reasons they were created. And this is what I love about photography, is that it is able to sort of slice out a bit of the world into a very artifactual frame that makes us look at these things quite differently. And it's one of the great powers of still photography. And Max Kozloff talks about the privilege of uncertainty. And I'm a full believer that a great photograph, because it has no future and no past, forces the viewer into a very personal relationship and understanding of what they're looking at. And that's one of my fascinations with the medium. This is the last one I'll show from this book. It is actually a tree lot that is south of Rome, And what you're looking at here are trees that some of which are hundreds of years old. And of course, the south of Italy has always been populated and farmed as olive tree groves. And that's what these are, is olive trees. And now the business is no longer profitable for many farmers. So they've been literally digging up these ancient olive trees and selling them as decorative trees now. And so for me, conceptually and physically, this was a very conflicting narrative. And I really enjoy the way that this photograph functions to both tether us to the natural world and to the built environment and consumerism at the same time. And it sort of presages some of the work I did after that, which I'll show you now, and is the subject of the work that's behind me on the walls. Basically, the working title right now is called Building Place. And that is a boring title, but it's something that sort of keeps me going right now. And, you know, I'll probably write 50 titles before I settle on the right one. But in this case, the whole exploration is about what does it take to earmark a physical location so that it is identified as place. Of course, the natural world doesn't call itself anything. We are responsible for these labels. So I find that to be one of the great facts of human existence, that if we find function, if we put the label on it, it changes from space to place. And this, in fact, is an image that was taken near Fort McMurray, Alberta, one of the last big towns in the north of Alberta, Canada. And what you're looking at here is a form about to be poured with cement in an arboreal forest that has never been touched before. So it's a sort of an interesting place to start this series to show the genesis of human construction and the built environment. These are also 4x5. Still very color-based, although I look at many things when I make a photograph. Where did it come from? Is there a way to project it or to construct it in a way that's provocative, to force the viewer into a relationship? So I look for contrasts. I love irony and a bit of humor. Contrasts, conflicts.
Hey Jay, we're getting a question, couple questions already, but someone's asking that term privilege of uncertainty. Is that your phrase there, or is that coming from some literature that you're reading?
No, it's from Max Kozloff, The Privileged Eye. And it's a book that he wrote a couple decades ago. It's a bit dense, but I find it to be just a remarkable seminal essay, especially, you know, just the book is seminal. And that is his term as far as I know. I don't know if he might have stolen it from someone else, but it's called, he calls it the privilege of uncertainty.
Yeah, it's a really great phrase.
I agree. Any other questions?
We did have two questions earlier. One was regarding talking about working on Same Dream Another Time, and you mentioned photographing funerals, and we had a question if you could expand on what that process was like.
Well, I did a couple, but the one that really comes out first, or the one that I recognize or remember the most, was Liberace's funeral. And when I heard that Liberace died, and of course, he was Mr. Las Vegas at the time. There was even a Liberace museum while he was still alive. And if I hope maybe I'm not so old that none of you know who this guy was, but he was this extravagant furred ringed pianist that would, in the 50s, he was everybody's darling. And so when he died, I believe it was like 88 or something, or 89, I just had to go out and see what his funeral would be like and see what the celebrities were. Because in Vegas, people come out for celebrity worship. So I was interested in the celebrities. I was interested in how celebrity worship is made manifest. And certainly at that event, there were some interesting crowds. I did, you know, as I say, I went out to Atlantic City to do the Miss America pageant, and the contrast between these, you know, beauty queens and everyday people was amazing. I went out, I have a wonderful photograph of Robert Goulet surrounded by fans that are just so affected they don't know what to do with themselves, you know, things like that. So Vegas is one of those places where there's these contrasts of community and status. Yeah. Here, I'll keep going here. As you can see, this work is as concentrated on boundaries, walls, frames within frames, how people create an almost tentative hold on the constructed environment and the idea of a place. So I'm looking for these almost liminal spaces that still suggest the construction of place. Whoops. This is in a public housing project in Trieste. This work, by the way, comes from all over the world now. There are photographs. I continue to shoot in Italy, and in fact, I'm about to go on a sabbatical for next fall, starting in May. And of course, I'm upset because my first destination was going to be in Lombardy around Milan, which I now will change, unfortunately. That was going to be one of my first areas to make photographs in. But I have photographed for this project. I've been all over Tuscany. I've been in the Veneto, around Trieste, Verona. I've also gone south again. So, and this project now includes images from Miami, from northern Canada, a lot from Chicago, some from Israel. So I'm looking for this manifest in many places right now. Another public housing project. This is a common area. So this becomes essentially the town square. A little playhouse built right next to the highway. This might be the closest thing to a portrait in this series that I'm going to show you. This iguana and I had a great collaboration for about 20 minutes. This is in Miami. This is also in Miami. This is outside Florence. That's a bench in Naples. This is a little pop-up set of stores in Chicago. This is a more recent image. And I'll end this with this image. This is done at the top of the Carrara marble quarries. And this is a sculpture studio that was sort of put up way at the top of the mountains. And it was just, talk about a strange place. The way light hit it, the way the artifacts worked was truly intriguing to me. So that's all I'm going to show you for what you might consider more traditional photographs. About 7 years ago, I started to play around with some other ideas. My background actually did not start as a photographer. I started as a musician. I was always making the plastic arts, welding, sculpture, a lot of painting, printmaking. My undergraduate degree is in printmaking and graphic design illustration. I never took a photo class before graduate school. But when I went to graduate school, I ended up at the Institute of Design at IIT, which of course is well known as one of the seminal schools at that time, which was in the late 70s. And if anybody, if you know about Moholy, who started the Institute of Design, of course, the photogram was one of the seminal methods of working with light. and creating a new kind of image. And I have to say, one of my great passions, even with my traditional photography, is to try to show the world in a way that you haven't seen it before. I'm constantly asking myself to show me something that I've never seen, to try to push the boundaries of the canon. And I try to do that with my students as well as myself. And as I say, I started off as a painter. I worked in collage for many, many years until I went to graduate school. In fact, I went to the Institute of Design and I was going to be a double major. I was going to, at that time, I was starting to make photographs. And in fact, I was going there to try to immerse myself in photography, but also it was one of the premier institutions for printmaking. And I had an undergraduate degree in printmaking. And I'll never forget the first day I walked into the Institute of Design, there were work people that were literally carrying out the litho stones and the presses, and they had dissolved the printmaking program. So in fact, that first day was a pretty decisive moment for me. I guess I assumed that I would be a photographer, because that was pretty much the only making discipline that had survived. Whereas the School of Design and the Institute of Design had tremendously important programs in animation, printmaking, drawing, and photography, filmmaking. They were all pretty much jettisoned by the late 70s, when the school was decisively moving in the direction of a design systems planning school. And so I was one of the last of Arthur Siegel's students, and I'm honored to say that. And that spirit of experimentation, the idea of somehow trying to reconcile the messy world around us, the idea of photography having a very particular mechanism to tether the viewer to the observable and cognitive world, was what we played around with. And so again, the idea of a photogram was a very interesting method to look at the world. About 7 years ago, I had done obviously a lot of documentary work and a lot of landscape, portraiture, figurative work. And I really wanted to sort of dive back into the ideas of non-figurative work, more abstract work, dealing specifically with form and color and space. So instead of working in a darkroom, which unfortunately I had gotten rid of my color darkroom in about 2003 and had moved completely digital, I started using a flatbed scanner, essentially in the same method that one would think about making photograms. So if you think of a photogram, what it is it's the paper looking up, and things that are closest to the paper are sharpest and more in focus, and those that recede away from the surface of the paper become softer. And so you have to reorient your thinking, firstly, to a very, very narrow depth of field. There is no depth of field. So you're playing around with sharpness and softness. The light source is very frontal, but I began to play around with defeating only that one light source and putting, 1,000 watts of light above the still lifes that I was doing on top of the scanner. And it started to create this wonderful kind of new thing. I started putting little mechanical robots on top of the scanner. It would create wonderful effects as it moved around during the linear scan. And that's what some of those lines are that you see on the frame, some of the more glitchy things. And I started to really enjoy the glitch. But eventually I found it very frustrating. I'm just showing you one of these flatbed scans. I call them scanograms or geograms. And by the way, the geogram is in honor of the rayogram, which Man Ray, of course, titled his photograms. Anyway, I decided actually to move on because I like being out in the real world. And someone had mentioned to me that there was this silly little object called a wand scanner. Oh, hold on one second. So this is an object. It's a silly little thing, and it's something that is used, I think, basically for either people to scan their receipts or, you know, for parents and grandparents to scan pictures of their kids. It was never meant to do the things that I've put it through, and I have destroyed many of these things in the last 7 years. But I'll show you a little bit of what I've done, and I'm starting with a very simple one. Oh, by the way, so the way it works, let me tell you how this works. So essentially, it is a small thing. It's about 8.5 inches long, but it has 900 DPI. And that is its great strength, is its detail and magnification capabilities. It's an incredible surface scanner that gives you full detail on some levels. And what happens is if you press this button and then you roll these rollers, can you see it? So there's a light. And as you roll this across a surface, this light is like the light that goes across a surface scanner. But you're able, I'm the motor. So I can roll this across any surface I want, or multiple surfaces, or surfaces that move. I can keep this still, and it, like in this one, what you're looking at is an escalator. And all I did was go to the bottom of the escalator and put it down on the floor. And what you're looking at is about a 45-second scan of an escalator as it moves across this rolling scan. But if I take the lead, I can then make an image like this. And so what you're looking at here is actually a scan of the doorpost of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. And obviously you can't see the detail here because of magnification. Come on. Please don't crash on me. There we go. So this is a detail of that scan. And so what you're looking at here is hundreds of years worth of carved marks made by pilgrims going to this church. And when I exhibited this piece first, this piece is about 18 feet long by about 2 feet high. And I am interested in trying to preserve the idea of the temporal aspect of this. In many ways, I found this to be an amazing tool at looking at certain artifacts in the built environment. So I also play around with very straight scans. I call this a straight scan, where I go around. I've made 10,000 of these things over the last few years. And you know, I love doing signage, and I love doing certain messages that people leave out in the real world. So these do have a little bit of manipulation after it's done, but for the most part are fairly straight scans. So here are a few, I think, more interesting text pieces. Now, because it's 8.5 inches tall, actually 8.533 inches tall, everything you're looking at here basically is that height. And the length is determined by the time that I spend moving the scanner across the surface. This was from Berlin. The last one was from Florence. This is a wall in Naples. Now, eventually, what I began doing was essentially doing real-time collage with this, because as long as you keep this scanner going and those rollers moving, you can move from one spot to another or create a constructed linear narrative of different shapes and form and color into a kind of a serial, almost a cartoony serial image. And what you're looking at here is from Istanbul. And this is a choreographed piece. So what I'll do is come upon a wall or some kind of a set of artifacts that I'm interested in, and I literally choreograph myself to say, I'm going to start here, I'm going to move to that, I'm going to move to that, I'm going to move to that. And then when I'm done, I get this long piece that is a kind of mixture between collage, visual art, even music, because I see each of these breaks as a kind of musical measure or a measure or a phrase, and that I love to keep. So some of these are really, really deliberate uses of the scanner to create an unusual narrative, moving it from left to right or right to left. This is actually a portrait that I do. I actually go into people's homes or institutions, and I will make scan works from their homes. This is actually a portrait of a studio of a friend of mine, an artist studio. So these are his priorities. But eventually this led to a series of works in 2016 where I was commissioned by the city of Florence to do some works that were part of the commemoration of the 1966 Arno floods, the floods of Florence, which destroyed many pieces of art, but also became a kind of UNESCO project where people came from all over the world to save the Renaissance work in Florence. So I spent about 3 weeks using this scanner within a block of the Arno River or right around and on the Arno River, and came back home with, again, thousands of scans that I put together into these vertical mural pieces. These were eventually printed up about 35 feet tall and placed on the outside of the big arts center in Florence. They were printed on Tyvek, and they became public art pieces. So these are 4 pieces from that. That last one is called Arno Bridge. This one is called Arno Love. This is called Arno Flood. And this is called Arno Restore. And people responded very positively toward this work. At the same time, as I say, I was doing hundreds and thousands of scans around the Arno River, and I had a lot of texts that I had been scanning. And so when I came back home, I decided to play around by isolating out small pieces of texts and working them together into this kind of impressionistic piece, which was to be redolent of the flow of the Arno River. And this ended up to be a big billboard on the outskirts of the city. And so I was doing this in fall 2016, but within a year, the pieces, the collage work had moved to things like this. And I started to get this vocabulary of how I could work with these pieces, and the idea of how cognition, either belief or non-belief, and illusion and reality kind of mix in these pieces is what is so fascinating to me. It also became another great avenue for me to explore my sense of color theory and form and space. And they started getting very complicated, and they started taking many months to do. This is about a 50 gig file. So they start to get pretty massive, and began to do things, like I say, I'd never seen them before. And it was very, very interesting, and it has been interesting to play with this concept. Then I began to play around with the idea of how these things have a genesis. And so in fact, I started to create these kind of spaces and objects or forms which begin as almost skeletal or suborganic themes. This one started with that central line, and then I began to wrap it with various textures and artifacts until it became something almost like an organic figure. But that same approach can also create landscape. Or I can push it beyond landscape and create another kind of organic being. This one is on white. And I love playing on black, by the way. And I began to use some of the theory I learned as a watercolorist back in school. If I'm on white, I start with the very lightest tones and get dark. And if I start with black, I start with the darkest tones and get lighter. So it was fascinating to apply some of the painting techniques to this. And finally, this one, and these are now, I'm in the process of making light boxes out of these that are approximately 24 by 84 inches. I'm still working on it. Wish I could show it to you. So this is where I ended up with the very complicated ones, but I'll end with two images. This last summer, I had to have some work done on my back, so I had a lot of time to take walks every day. I had to take walks. And so I would take the scanner and I started scanning just edges. The idea that that point of contact was the sharpest edge, and then as things move away from that edge, they get softer and they fall off. And so what you're looking at here is 4 edges on black. And I'll end with this one, which is 4 edges on white. So that is my little talk with the pictures, and I will be happy to discuss anything you want.
Awesome, Jay. Thank you so much. So we've already had like a couple questions, and I'm sure a few more will start rolling in. Yudi we have Yudi asking a question here, and she's wondering if a lot of these works that you just showed, the scans, have you made physical prints of those?
Oh, yes, I have. Interestingly, I mean, things that I probably would never do on my traditional photographs. I love printing these on metallic papers, and they start to really take off. The standard print size, my work print size is about 30 by 40, or even small, maybe 32 by, or 24 by 32. These are the smallest I would make those, because they do need to have that presence. Unfortunately, these days, everything's virtual, so it's hard to show the prints. But as I say, when I exhibit these, the biggest ones were the 35, 40-foot ones that were in Florence. And they go down from there, and especially the long ones, if I were to exhibit them, anywhere from 10 to 20 feet long, yeah. Anything else?
My question was, I was wondering, how did you really make them? I know like you scan them, but how did you make them to those cool like fish looking thing?
Well, each of those are basically collage. So I go through my thought. Now, it depends. You know, I play different games with myself. Sometimes I will take little pieces of larger scans, but that are really organized around a place or reflect a certain time period. So there's a kind of, I don't know, conceptual, you know, dovetailing of those little pieces. But all of those, a lot of those pieces are really tiny bits of scan that I will put together. So the ones that I think you're referring to, I might start with one of those edges. So you get this sharp and soft effect. And then I keep layering and layering and layering and layering until it creates this form. And I have to say, in many ways, it's, someone's asking, did I put it together online? No, these are all done in Photoshop. I've become a Photoshop monk these days. And it's an amazing tool. And as I learn more about Photoshop, I don't do a lot of twirling and swirling and things like this. I do now, usually, essentially when you use the scanner, the speed of it is not always, or the final image of it doesn't always look the way it did in the world. It can compress or expand. So in Photoshop, I can stretch some of these things back to their normal disposition, or I can contract them back to a normal disposition, or I can distort them that way. But I don't do a ton of distortion. It's still pretty faithful to the original materials.
Oh, wow. Thank you.
We had another really great question come in from Zolt Dunn asking, curious, what kind of audio would you find fitting with these scans? So if you were to prescribe some type of music to accompany them, what type of music do you think that would be?
Well, like I said, for me, some of those scans were actually about music making for me. And I hope that in a way they're sort of synesthetic and that they sort of suggest phrasing and sound, or at least how musical progressions function. So it would be hard for me to assign any particular artist to it. You know, I mean, I'd hate to be presumptuous and say I'd like Miles Davis behind it, but that would be a pretty big ask. So it's hard for me to throw somebody else into this mix. I don't know if you have any composers you want me to work with. I actually would love to do some live performances with huge screens. I'd love to work with a dance company and actually have a live performance with performers using these scanners and somehow be able to tether them to a very large screen and see how we could do a choreographed piece using them. I think that would be very fun.
Great. We've got another question coming in from a familiar name. Jonathan Castillo is asking, could you talk about how you think this work relates to your background in the ID and maybe how this connects to a distinctly Chicago lineage of photography and image making?
You know, I mean, I tried to answer a little bit of that before. Certainly the tradition of the ID goes back to Moholy, and Moholy in some ways could be called a proto-conceptualist, but of course he was one of the strongest visualists that I can imagine, certainly for his time. And the idea of embracing mechanical means to record the world was part of his playbook. But he was also making work at a time when there were great combinations of man-made artifacts with technologies. He was one of the first to, you know, really employ plastics in his sculptures. He made kinetic, his famous, what is it called, white, gray, black video was basically a shadow and a highlight piece that was generated through a kinetic sculpture and lighting, so it would project on the wall. But I would say the one thread that really is consistent in the ID philosophy is that the visual is primary to photography. And I know that sounds rather obvious, but I think in some ways that's been lost. Photographers really don't learn a lot of visual theory anymore. A lot of it is social theory, a lot of it is mimetic, a lot of it has to do with, I guess, navigation through the world rather than visual navigation through the world. And there's some brilliant, obviously brilliant photographers working today. But at the ID, if it wasn't in the picture, it didn't exist. And so we were very, very pushed to be aware of every inch, every bit of that frame, and to activate it in a way that had resonance with other elements in the composition. Composition was not only thought of as a formal thing, but as a reflection of the world and how it is consumed and re-articulated through the photographic frame. So it was very, very visual. And so that idea of experimentation is just part of my, you know, part of my DNA in some levels. Even when I started doing documentary work, for me, the idea was that the world was providing me a palette of material that I myself could never have thought of. Basically, I was a painter out in the real world. But I don't want you to think I'm only a formalist. I'm very interested in how the actions of the world and the causes and effects that we see in the world can be transmitted and communicated through visual means. So the idea of going abstract to me really is really on the continuum, is on the same continuum. I do not see this as a difference in kind. I see it as a difference in degree. And for me, I just don't have, you know, when I get tired of working in the studio on these crazy collages and scans, I take the 4x5 out and I go make some landscapes or some architecture pictures. And a lot of times I won't take the scanner with me because it's too tempting to stop the 4x5 work, because the 4x5 work off, where the scanner, I can make a new scan every 5 inches. I may drive 200 miles to make one 4x5 picture. So it's just it's a different approach, but still my head, my crazy head.
Yeah, thanks for filling us in on that. And it's really interesting to think about that connection all the way back to some of these ideas that were placed in the Bauhaus. And it's also inspiring. This is one of the questions that I wanted to ask, which you basically just kind of answered, is, you know, what is it like to reinvent your practice and to, you know, to reconsider your approach to art making? And I think that idea is really relevant right now because, you know, all of us are in an unprecedented moment, and some people go out into the world to make work, and you found a way to operate on both ends of the spectrum. And just wanted to point that out, that it's inspiring for all of us watching who are makers to try to, you know, to continue being creative and to make things, right?
Well, you know, I mean, obviously there are various models of art making one can look at. You know, if you look at a Jasper Johns who just keeps making the target and the flag over and over and over and over again, especially the mid-century, mid-20th century modernists, the whole idea was to just dive deeply into one, or shall we say, a certain type of approach, and just keep moving it forward. Think of a Joseph Stella, who essentially has just added on every year. There seems to be a new addition, but yet still a lineage through the same work that connects from beginning to end. If we look at a de Kooning, while of course many of these artists started off as, say, traditional art makers and more representational painters, especially the abstract painters started to dive deeply into very specific types of form. So I guess I come out of that tradition where, and I think my documentary work and all my works really do tend to be very, I hope, deep dives into particular strategies or visions of the world. I don't think I did reinvent myself. I don't think anybody actually reinvents themselves. I think what they do is they exercise parts of themselves. And for me, you know, you get to a certain point, you say, well, am I ever going to go back and re-explore some things that I was interested in 30, 40 years ago? And that's what happened to me a few years ago. I said, you know, I like that kind of work. And it also gives me another method of making art when I'm not out on the street, or I'm not in the country, or I'm not in the outside environment. So for me, they are very complementary.
Yeah, yeah, I see that. So one last final question. We have Kristen asking, we see a lot of books on your shelves. Do you have a favorite photo book or favorite painter working right now?
Oh my God, don't do that. They're all favorites. That's why I have them on the shelf. You know, it's funny. Some of the most important books to me on my shelf are actually Italian Renaissance painting books and things that deal with color theory in the Renaissance or color theory in Greek art. Those are all very important progenitors of what we do today as visual art makers. So, you know, I still love the Mannerist Italian painters, Del Sarto. Michelangelo was essentially a Mannerist artist who took the tenets of the Renaissance and pushed those formal constructs into a very accelerated level of visual form. There's probably no one better to learn color theory from than, say, Pontormo. And, you know, when we look at his deposition, you probably don't need to look at another painting and learn about color than that one. So I'm very influenced by those folks. But you know, look, a lot of photographers are brilliant, brilliant image makers. You know, I sort of came of age as a photographer when people like Mitch Epstein and Martin Parr were coming up. You know, we have great, you know, Chicago has some of the strongest color photographers working today, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, if you look at Melissa Pinney's work, or you look at Paul D'Amato's work, especially look at someone like Aimé Beaubien. These are people who are masters at color, and who the inflection of color and subject matter together create these experiences that are absolutely astounding. They're wonderful photographers, and I consider it an honor to be colleagues with them. You know, there's a great Neapolitan photographer named Dagassi, who did one of the most amazing documents of the Neapolitan mafia. Amazingly beautiful color photographs, but very disturbing as well. You know, those are a few of my favorites, but I've been collecting this stuff forever. So it's hard to say which one is my fave, but I bring it from all of them. Trust me, I do.
Yeah, I totally understand that one. Inspiration comes from everywhere. And so we've hit 1 o'clock. That's our official time, but I'm sure if Jay is willing to hang around to talk a little bit more, we can do that. For those of you that have maybe a couple more questions, I did want to, while people are still signed in, remind everyone that coming up on April 29th, that we have the Photos at Zoom Portraiture and the Human Subject, which will be led by our curatorial assistant, Lindley Warren McInnes. Super excited for that conversation. And then, of course, on May 1st, we also have the MoCP Behind the Lens with Ross Sawyers. It'll go along with the constructed photography presentation that Kristen Taylor gave us. So those are going to be events to look forward to. Thank you all for being here. And again, if you'd like to hang out for a few more moments to talk with Jay, we can do that.
Everybody's saying thank you, and I thank you for coming.
Great to see you, Jay. This is Olivia from St. Louis.
You know, I saw you on the call. It's nice to see you too. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good.
Are you in St. Louis?